So, so what I want to do then is introduce British empiricism, but I want to finish up Descartes first. Descartes gets a little technical. It's a little more cloudy today, but I know it's still hard to see. Actually, why am I shutting the door? You tell me, why am I shutting the door? There's no reason to shut the door. What I wanted to do was turn off the lights. That's why I came over here. Okay. Oh, my. So we saw that Descartes said, I don't need to raise doubts about individual beliefs. That would be a program that would take too much time, right, and effort. I could never get through it. What I can do, says Descartes, is raise doubts about whole categories of classes of beliefs. And we saw that he raises a doubt about the beliefs we have based on what our senses tell us, based on the information from our senses. He raises a doubt by this dream conjecture, the conjecture that, well, maybe we're dreaming all the time. And even though this is a bit of a hyperbolic doubt, right, it's an exaggerated doubt, he still says the fact that I can raise this theoretical doubt that everything I perceive, even the stuff around me in the room that I perceive clearly, if I can raise a doubt about it and say, well, maybe it's all a dream, then that enables him to conclude that the information and the evidence he gets based on his senses is not absolutely certain. So the next category of beliefs he talks about are the beliefs that we get from pure mathematics and logic, like 2 plus 3 equals 5, like, there are 4 sides to a square. And basically, he has to really go out on a limb to raise doubts about these. But remember, he's trying to at least raise a conceivable doubt. And just imagining that he might be dreaming is for him not enough. Okay, now, it's louder than you think, right? See, because if you recall last time, Descartes says, well, wait a second, even if I'm dreaming, even if the square I'm talking about is an imaginary dream object, it's still going to have 4 sides. If I've got 2 apples and 3 apples sitting on a table, but the whole thing is something I'm dreaming, I still have 2 plus 3 equals 5 apples, right? 2 plus 3. So he says, how could I raise a doubt about something like that? Well, he brings in this concept that maybe he's being systematically deceived by an evil genius or evil demon. And I said last time, the way to put some credibility to this is imagine that some entity is trying to screw you up every time you're trying to do a problem in mathematics, right? And so if you've ever gotten less than 100 on a math test, you made a mistake along the way. Well, imagine there's some evil character. He calls it the evil genius. It's more like a demonic creature. He says, it seems inconsistent with God's goodness that God would be deceiving me. So why not imagine some demonic creature who's messing me up every time I'm trying to do something, some kind of proof in math? Well, this enables him then to conclude that just about all the beliefs he seems to have are doubtful. It says a powerful enough demon could delude me in all my judgments about things my senses tell me, but also about what mathematics tells me. And even whether I have a body and hands and eyes, etc. Maybe I'm just dreaming I am. As I said, we could all be brains in a vat. Note how the people in the Matrix were in little pods, and a computer program was creating a false world for them. Well, he says, all may be doubted. So, is there anything that is beyond doubt? Does our story have a happy ending? I don't know if you remember Archimedes from your physics class in high school, if you took physics. See, I don't even know what they teach anymore, right? I was a poly boy, so we got a lot of science in high school. But at one point, I mean, Archimedes seems to have invented the lever and the fulcrum, or at least talked about it. And he said, well, you know, in theory, if I had a long enough lever, I could even use that leverage to lift the earth. But what I need in order to do that, in other words, if I'm going to try to lift the earth, in theory, what I need is a place to rest the lever on, right? Let's see. That's about as accomplished as I am in drawing human beings, you know. So, in other words, we need a fixed point to rest that lever on. And what Descartes says he's looking for in order to provide a fixed point for knowledge is an absolutely certain principle. So Archimedes claimed that movement of the entire Earth would be possible if he had a firm, immovable point to rest his lever on. Descartes longs then to find one certain unshakable truth which, on which to rest the rest of knowledge. And so does he find it? Well, of course he does. And what is it? Well, Descartes says if an evil demon is deceiving me about everything else, the one thing he cannot deceive me about is the fact that I'm here to be deceived, that I exist. Or another way of putting it, if I'm dreaming most of what I'm experiencing, and everything is unreal because it's a dream, nonetheless, it's my dream. I have to exist to be dreaming it. And if I'm doubting everything, because it might be a dream object or some false belief that the evil genius is creating, if I'm doubting everything, the one thing I cannot doubt, says Descartes, is that I am here to do the doubting. So this turns out to be his first principle, that Descartes himself exists. Now, we're going to see in the next slide that there's a much more well-known way he puts this. So concerning whether he should doubt his own existence, he observes, even if he has authored his own thoughts, he nonetheless is something in order to be the author of his own thoughts. Even if he has convinced himself that there's absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies, he has to exist to convince himself of this. Or if he's doubting everything, he has to exist to do the doubting. So the way Descartes, so a deceptive demon is not, says Descartes, able to persuade him that he should doubt his own existence. And so here he finds his absolute first truth. Descartes says, even if a demon is constantly deceiving me, I undoubtedly exist. In other words, I have to be around to be deceived constantly. And the way he expresses this in this little book, The Meditations, on which this PowerPoint is based, is the statement or the proposition, I am, I exist, is true every time I think it or pronounce it. But, so Descartes finds his Archimedean point, the indubitable, that is beyond doubt, and the indubitable axiom on which he wants to base all of his philosophy. Descartes expresses this in another work as the famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And usually, if somebody has taken no philosophy, most of you, how many of you have heard of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, before taking philosophy? Well, not everyone, but a lot of people. And so this he takes as the axiom on which he wants to build the whole of philosophy. Now, before I talk about how he tries to get his other beliefs back, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what Descartes says here, but he is famous for thinking in a more detailed way about what the mind is and what we are. That's one of the things that put him on the map as a philosopher. So Descartes searches for his own human nature. One of the things philosophy worries about is, what are we as human beings? Well, for Descartes, we are essentially an immortal soul, just like Plato and Socrates thought. He says he's not going to worry about the classical definition of man, meaning human beings, as rational animals. Even though we saw people like Aristotle certainly worried about that. That's basically what we were for Aristotle. Remember, that's what separated us from the plants and from the other animals, that we were rational. We were reasoning beings. So he says, I'm going to take a different way instead of worrying about the classical definition. He says, well, I believed I had a body, and there were certain things, processes that my soul performed, like perceiving things, thinking, initiating bodily movements, eating. But he says, I didn't give a lot of thought to what the soul is. I thought it's like a wind or fire or ether. It's funny, when I became a ham radio operator when I was in high school at the age of 14. And the interesting thing is, there was a ham radio store right up on 36th Street in Hamden, Hon, that I could walk to, and they had a coffee hour in the mornings. And if you're talking about the mid-1960s, there were people alive then. Think about it, folks. We couldn't go back and talk to people like Socrates and Plato, people who were there at the beginning of philosophy. But there were people then who were alive at the very beginning of radio. They were sending spark signals across the Atlantic. And in the early days of radio, there was a debate as to whether the luminous ether existed, because the ether was thought to be the medium through which radio waves traveled. In other words, if you throw a rock in a pond, and it's a still pond, you get waves that go out from where the rock went in, but they are waves in a medium, in that case the water in the pond. So the thought was, if radio waves are waves, what are they waves in? And they posited this ethereal thing called the luminous ether. Now, for reasons that even I don't know, I understand Einstein's theories basically did away with that as a scientific hypothesis. They don't think, it doesn't exist. But in Descartes' day, they were thinking about things like this. So what does Descartes say? He says, well, the body, now here's something you want to, okay, anybody listening to the replay of this in headphones will appreciate that. Since I have a mic, sorry folks. Body, as used by these modern philosophers, is used ambiguously. In other words, with two meanings. Sometimes when Descartes talks about body, he talks about the human body, our body. When he says, I may not have hands and a body, he's clearly talking in context about the human body. But there's another meaning of the word body that is also used, and that's taking body as a synonym for matter, for material substance, for the kind of stuff our bodies, along with this desk and the other stuff in the perceivable world, is made of. So he says things in this world have properties. Body has shape. It's located in space, right? And these are Newtonian principles, and he understood that. Matter occupies space to the exclusion of other matter, other bodies, right? And obviously we can perceive it, and we can move about in space. Now, why list this? Well, what Descartes wants to do, and this is where he broke a lot of new ground in philosophy, he wants to, well, first of all, he says that a lot of these attributes of the body are things we can doubt, right? But where Descartes broke new ground is in talking about what we are as a perceiving human being, as a perceiving mind or soul. And he says, yeah, okay, things like movement, perception, can be doubted. But Descartes says, what are the properties of my mind? He says, the part that can't be doubted, part of the I think, therefore I am, is thought. So, in other words, for Descartes, thought or thinking is the essential property of an immaterial mind or substance. So Descartes considers thought to be inseparable from his nature, like three angles are to a triangle. So he says if he should cease to think, he should cease to exist, which raises some problems about do we exist when we're conscious. But strictly speaking, here's how Descartes defines himself. He's like a kernel. He's a thinking thing, a thing that thinks. So we're essentially an immaterial soul that has a body. But what created the mind-body problem for Descartes was that when he listed the properties of mind, they were very different. So Descartes was a pioneer in what came to be known as faculty psychology. In other words, the view of the human mind, and this was the precursor to scientific psychology like Freud and later psychologists. He says, what do I mean? Can I expand on what I mean by saying I'm a thing that thinks? And he says, or what does thinking mean? Well, for Descartes, thinking means having various mental events or processes going on inside of me, just like in the body, various physical processes like circulation of blood and things like that are going on. So he says, I have various doubts. Thinking means I perform certain mental processes like doubting, understanding something, affirming or denying something, imagining or perceiving something. And so this was new ground for Descartes. So now Descartes knows that even in his own day, most people think that we have more confidence that we have a body than that we have an immaterial, immortal soul. Descartes' trying to convince us that just the opposite is true. So we say, well, we have more confidence in the existence of the body because it's known by the senses, and I can't get a mental image of my immortal soul or mind. But Descartes said, isn't it odd that we would have a more distinct grasp of something that we can doubt, that is doubtful in its existence, like our physical body? He's saying, why should we have more evidence for that than the truly existing self that is the I of I think? Again, that's a computer robocall. Okay. I'm not so rude as to hang up on somebody, but you know. Okay, so I don't want to go into this in a lot of detail, but Descartes tries to convince us, and here's his rationalism, that it's by reason that we know that we're a thinking thing. And I know this is extremely abstract, but think about this. Take a piece of wax, heat it. All the properties it seemed to have before you heated it seem to vanish. And yet I say, well, this is the same piece of wax as the piece of wax I had before I heated it. Descartes tries to convince us that it's not the senses that would tell us that, because all the properties of the wax have changed, right? It was hard, now it's soft because I've heated it. It once had a yellow color, now it's clear. It once had no odor, now it has an odor. And, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So Descartes says the true nature of the wax is perceived by the mind alone. And it's my mind, my reason, that tells me it's the same piece of wax. Now, I find it hard to get on board with Descartes here, because basically, I mean, when I was in grad school, and you're poor by definition if you're a grad student, I would often do things like make homemade fudge. And I had a good fudge recipe, like from absolute scratch, right, where you started out with a couple of squares of Baker's unsweetened chocolate, and you melted it in a double boiler. Well, think about it. Suppose I put 2 squares of chocolate in a double boiler, and I stand there and I watch the thing melt. So now I've got a puddle of chocolate at the bottom of that pot, that double boiler. Descartes is trying to say it's your reason that tells you that puddle of chocolate is the same chocolate as the two squares of chocolate. Not your senses. But if I stood there and watched the thing melt, come on, Descartes, you're trying to convince me it's my reason and not my senses that tells me this? So I have a problem with this, but we're not going to get off onto this tangent too much. But he says awareness of the self is truer than the existence of a material thing. He says anything that would confirm the existence of the wax also confirms me as a perceiving, existing self. So if I say the wax exists because I see it, I have to exist to be the one to see the wax. If I say the wax exists because I touch it, I have to exist to touch it. And if I say it exists because I have a mental image, a perceived image of it, that's what he means by imagining it. You know what? We'll look at the video on Friday because we only have about 10 minutes. So he tries to convince us that we have a more certain knowledge of ourselves. He says if material things are known not by the senses but by being understood by the intellect, the mind is known even better than this. Now, David Hume tries to provide skeptical arguments to disprove Descartes. But how do we get from the empiricists? Well, what I want to talk about briefly is the transition. So you say, all right now, at this stage in his philosophy, in this doubting method, this methodic doubt, right now, what's the only thing Descartes knows for sure? That he exists, right? You say, well, okay, that's nice, but what about the existence of the world? What about the existence of other human beings, other minds? How do you get there, Descartes? Well, here's roughly how he tries to do it, and it has to do, and it's roundabout. Probably none of us is doubting that there's a briefcase and a table sitting in the front of the room. But now, even if you're a deep person of faith or a person of deep, you take your religious beliefs seriously, especially a belief in God. Even if you're a person of faith, you might say, well, it's partly because of faith that I believe that there's a God. And if somebody said, well, what are you more sure of? That there's a briefcase sitting up front and a table, or that those exist, or that God exists? I think most people, when we would say, well, okay, I'm sure that there's a table here, but my belief in God is based in part on faith, and maybe I'm not quite as sure, even though I'm pretty convinced that God is there. Well, Descartes is trying to do the opposite. The way Descartes tries to get the beliefs that he raises skeptical arguments about back is by first proving God's existence and that God is no deceiver. And if God is no deceiver, then he tries to get back the existence of the things he questioned right off the bat, the existence of things that we perceive around us. And here's the way he does it. I'm just trying to sketch this out. I'm not going to test you on this, but he looks at this one example of an absolutely certain truth that he thinks he has. the I think, therefore I am, the cogito. And he says, well, what were the marks it had that made me think it was necessarily true? It had to be true beyond doubt. And Descartes uses what Richard Rorty in the 20th century says is a visual metaphor, for necessary truth. What Descartes says is that that belief is clear and distinct. Now, why is it a visual metaphor? Well, you've seen like old-fashioned, projectors. Maybe someone in elementary school tried to show a film strip, and they were trying to get the thing in focus by. Well, you and I know that this thing is pretty much in focus, this projector, and so the letters are clear now that the sun has been covered by the clouds, but they're also distinct. I can see the T and the H and the I and the S. They're distinct from one another. But you also know that if we were to get this thing out of focus so that the letters are no longer clear, they would blur into one another and they wouldn't be distinct. So that's kind of the basis of this visual metaphor. So Descartes says, well, do I have any other beliefs that have the same mark of clarity and distinctness? Now, here's where the issue of whether or not we have knowledge at birth. Remember, for Descartes, unlike Plato and Socrates, some knowledge was put into us when we're born. That's not when we forget it. Descartes says, one of the ideas that I have that has the same mark of necessary truth is my idea of God. Now, we went over the ontological argument, didn't we, in here? I think we did. Yeah. I forget. I haven't gone over it yet at Essex. But note how that didn't depend on any facts about the world, like the design argument did. Well, basically, Descartes has to use an abstract argument to prove God, like the ontological argument, because at this point, he's doubting the existence of the world. So, roughly what he does is, he proves God's existence by the ontological argument, and there are one or two other a priori arguments that are less well known that he uses. And as part of the qualities of God is God's moral perfection and that God is no deceiver. Well, Descartes would say, now let's talk about this other stuff we doubted, like what we perceive around us. Descartes says, if God created me such that I thought there was a table here, a real material table here, and there wasn't, either I was in a dream or the evil genius was messing my mind up thinking there's a table. He says, if God created me so that I would be constantly deceived about whether there's a real table here, wouldn't God, in a sense, be a deceiver? But God is morally perfect, and he can't be a deceiver. So he created me such that if I am convinced that I'm perceiving a real table here, then there must be a real table here, and I can have confidence now, and I don't have to doubt whether or not there are real tables and chairs. So that's how he kind of gets back the beliefs he questioned in the beginning. So you say, well, what have we achieved? We're right back where we started before we started doubting things. Well, what we've achieved is now Descartes thinks he can reason and provide deductive arguments to back up our ordinary common sense beliefs that we can know there's a real world and know that God exists, etc., and know that we exist continuously. So, but what happens with the empiricists is, and we'll see this in John Locke right off the bat, he rejects the belief in innate ideas, so they cannot take Descartes' way out. Well, we'll say more about this. I'll start out with the video next time, because it's 10 of, and I don't want to make anybody late. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I passed around a roll. Oh, did I? Oh, yeah, I did. Okay, this is the one I was saving. So if anybody missed it, I'll put it up here, and you can sign it on the way out. And we'll see. I'm going to put a PowerPoint on British empiricism up on Blackboard for next time. Okay, let me stop the recording.